In this module, we're going to be talking about how psychology has traditionally approached the concept of learning, right? The idea of acquiring new information over time that hopefully persists. The field of learning has historically been dominated by a perspective of psychology called the behaviorist. The behaviorists were struggling with the mind-body problem that we've already addressed and attempted to find a way to solve it very early on in the sort of development of the field. We talked about the difference between behavior and mental processes. Right? Behavior is something that is easy to observe. So behaviorists said, hey, we can observe behavior. We can't observe mental processes. So we can't look at the mind. We can't study the mind scientifically, but we can sure as heck study behavior scientifically because we can observe it. We can measure it. We can make predictions with it. So the behaviorists are a perspective psychology that looks at the input and the output. What is happening in the environment and what does that then induce in terms of behavior in the organism? When we change the environment, how does it change the behavior? How do different environments affect behavior? We're looking at the input, we're looking at the output. The behaviorist very specifically chooses not to look at the mind. In fact, some behaviorists even decided the mind is an illusion, right? And that it doesn't even exist, and that we can fully explain all of animal and human behavior simply by looking at changes in the environment. The behaviorists actually did not emerge originally out of the field of psychology. They actually emerged from the field of chemistry, interesting enough, when a young Russian chemist was seeking fame and fortune in the field of chemistry and looked out upon the world and said, I wonder how I'm going to gain fame and fortune. And he decided, well, you know what? I'm going to gain fame and fortune by determining the chemical composition of dog saliva. Good idea, right? Well, what are you going to need a whole heck of a lot of if you want to determine the chemical composition of dog saliva? If you said dog saliva, you win. So Pavlov set up this apparatus that would allow him to collect saliva from the dogs. He had these tubes that would attach to the salivary gland. He would then present sort of a meat paste or a food to the dog. They would then start to smell it. They would salivate, and you could collect it in a jar. Easy enough, except something interesting started to occur. Pavlov would use a bell that he would ring to alert his lab assistants that it was time to feed the dogs. What Pavlov discovered is after several weeks of the bell going off and then feeding the dogs started to salivate to the sound of the bell before they even saw or smelled the food. The bell was serving to produce a response in the dog. This does not happen right away. Dogs are not naturally inclined to salivate in response to a bell, but sure enough, after repeatedly pairing the bell with the food, they would start to salivate to the bell. Pavlov looked at that and said, you know what, I think this is probably more interesting than the chemical composition of dog saliva, and devoted himself to studying this pattern of behavior, which came known as conditioning and then classical conditioning. This has been studied repeatedly by behaviorists looking at how different associations of stimuli in the environment can induce specific behaviors in organisms. So it starts with what's called the neutral stimulus. The neutral stimulus is something that does not elicit a response. A neutral stimulus produces no response. So in the case of Pavlov's experiment, we can think about the bell as being the neutral stimulus. The bell does not usually, when it's rung, produce a response in the dog. When the dog has no prior experiences with the bell, it rings, there's no response. We can contrast this with what is called the unconditioned stimulus. The unconditioned stimulus occurs when something is presented to the dog that elicits a response without any need for training or exposure to occur. So if you have a hungry dog and you show it some yummy dog food, what is the dog going to do? The dog is then going to salivate. Right? The dog does not have to learn to salivate to food. It's an instinctual response, right? We can think of other instinctual responses. If somebody comes up and pinches you, you flinch or yelp. You don't have to learn to do that. It's an instinctual response. Right? Anything that we're sort of born responding to is unconditioned. It's unlearned. So the unconditioned stimulus is anything that elicits an unconditioned response. The neutral stimulus produces no response. Then the unconditioned stimulus produces an unconditioned response. In the case of Pavlov's work, that's the dog food and then the salivation. All right, so remember, the stimulus is the thing in the environment. The response is the behavior. Now we're going to start associating and combining the bell ringing plus the food. So we're going to ring the bell, then present the food. Ring the bell, then present the food. Now the dog is going to salivate in response to the food early on. That's an unconditioned response because the dog is salivating in response to the unconditioned stimulus of the food. But by repeatedly pairing the neutral stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus, pretty soon the dog is going to start salivating in response to the bell alone. Once the bell can elicit a salivation response, it is now considered a conditioned stimulus. Right? It had to be learned. That's why it's conditioned. The dog did not salivate initially to the bell, but after repeatedly pairing it with the unconditioned stimulus, the dog now salivates in response to it. The conditioned stimulus elicits the conditioned response, which is salivation, in response to the bell. Right? So the formally neutral conditioned stimulus produces the conditioned response of salivation. So you may be noticing here that the unconditioned response and the conditioned response is the same thing, the salivation. And the neutral stimulus and the conditioned stimulus are the same thing, the bell, right? The neutral stimulus becomes the conditioned stimulus after learning has occurred. The unconditioned response becomes the conditioned response depending on what it's in response to. So if the dog is salivating in response to the unconditioned stimulus, it is an unconditioned response. However, if it is salivating in response to the conditioned stimulus, it is a conditioned response. So the UR and the CR are the same response, but they're triggered by different events. Whereas the neutral stimulus and the conditioned stimulus are the same stimulus, but we differentiate them by what they trigger. Right? The unconditioned response is triggered by the unconditioned stimulus. The conditioned response is triggered by the conditioned stimulus. The neutral stimulus triggers a neutral response, and the conditioned stimulus triggers a conditioned response. So the main things here that we're talking about are the unconditioned response, the conditioned response, the neutral stimulus, the unconditioned stimulus, and the conditioned stimulus. Right? The UR, the CR, the NS, the US, the CS. All right, so this works for dogs, it works for rats, but doesn't even work for humans. Well, early on, psychologists weren't sure. One of the well-known sort of case studies that was done was the case of little Albert. Little Albert was a baby that was born to a custodian at the University of James Watson. The mother was single and was struggling to provide childcare and maintain her job at the university. So Watson's graduate student, Rosalind, offered to help babysit Albert during the day while her mom worked. Well, unbeknownst to her, they were bringing him in for a little bit of an experiment to see if classical conditioning could work on humans. So what they would do is they would present little Albert with, say, a lab bunny, a bunny from the lab. And early on, little Albert was vaguely interested, but didn't care too much about the bunnies, didn't really respond to them. Right? But then the experiment started. As Rosalind held little Albert next to the bunny, Watson would sneak up behind little Albert with a mallet and a steel rod and then go, bang! Present the bunny, bang! Present the bunny, bang! Okay, not hitting little Albert, right? He's using the mallet to hit the steel rod. You know what happens when little babies hear a loud bang behind their head? They cry. Every time. Trust me, I've never met a baby that if you go up behind them and go bang, doesn't start to cry. Right? And then by repeatedly doing this over and over again, present the bunny, bang, present the bunny, bang, present the bunny, bang, what do you think is going to happen when we start presenting the bunny all by itself? Pretty soon, little Albert starts to cry and run away from the bunny alone. Sure enough, classical conditioning works just fine on humans. So I've got 4 examples here. A little game we'll call Find the US, UR, NS, CS, CR. So I have 4 scenarios here. Go ahead and read through each of these 4 scenarios and try to identify the US, UR, NS, CS, and CR. Write them down for each scenario, and then we'll go through them at the start of the next video. But go ahead and try to figure them out on your own before we start that video.